My name is Jake Riley. They called me Maverick in the cockpit. I flew classified missions for the Air Force, the kind that don't make it into the history books, the kind that disappear with the sunset. Most of my career was spent chasing shadows, but I never believed in the things people whisper about at 3 in the morning, not until Tahoe. I was based out of a small, discreet facility tucked away in the high Nevada desert, not far from the California border. Our primary operational zone was the sprawling, magnificent Sierra Nevada mountains, and right in the heart of it, the colossal, almost mythic presence of Lake Tahoe. If you've ever seen Tahoe at night, you know it's a black mirror reflecting a million pinpricks of light. It's beautiful, it's ancient, and it hides its secrets well. My job wasn't glamorous. It was a grind. Night patrols, low-altitude sweeps, monitoring airspace for foreign incursions or, as we were officially told, unauthorized civilian aircraft. The air up there is clean, cold, and utterly silent, except for the roar of my own engines. That silence was my comfort. I knew the stars, I knew the peeps, and I knew every sound that belonged in that sky. It was a Tuesday night, late September. The air was crisp and the moon was a thin sliver. I was flying that route, a standard figure-8 pattern that took me over Carson City and then straight across the widest part of the lake. I was running a little behind schedule, maybe 3 hours past midnight, but the sky was perfect for cruising. I remember thinking about how deep the lake was, over 1,600 feet in some places, enough to swallow a skyscraper, enough to swallow a secret. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't an airliner. It wasn't the reflection of a satellite. It was a single point of light, far below my altitude, maybe only a few hundred feet above the surface of the water, near the western shore, closer to Emerald Bay. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe a fisherman, illegally out too late. But it wasn't a steady light. It pulsed once, a deep emerald green that vanished the moment I registered it. I marked the coordinates in my mind, standard procedure. 10 minutes later, on my return leg, I focused my instruments on the spot. Nothing. No heat signature, no radar return, no acoustic anomaly. Just the smooth, black expanse of Tahoe. I pushed the thought away. Fatigue, maybe. But then, as I was banking east over the towering pines, preparing to head back toward base, the light returned. This time it was moving. It wasn't near the surface anymore. It was climbing. And the speed was impossible. I've seen hypersonic missile tests. I've seen objects defying the G-force limits of the most advanced technology on Earth. But this was silent. It had no contrail, and it went from near zero altitude to maybe 50,000 feet, higher than me, in what I estimated was less than 3 seconds. The light was dull white now, and it moved in a smooth, fluid arc that no conventional physics could explain. It didn't look like it was flying. It looked like it was thinking its way across the sky. And then it stopped. Instantly. Absolutely motionless against the backdrop of stars, defying inertia itself. I checked my instruments. My own jet was screaming at me. Alarms for everything. Radar malfunction, sensor failure, communication static. The light just hung there. A cold, indifferent star that had suddenly decided to join the night sky. I was a special forces pilot. I was trained to be ready for anything. But no training, no briefing, no scenario ever prepared me for the sight of a completely silent, impossibly fast, and utterly motionless light watching me from the darkness above Lake Tahoe. That was the night the sky stopped belonging to me. And it was just the beginning of what the lake was hiding.
I didn't report the light, not officially. There's a silent, unwritten code in the Air Force, especially in special ops. You see things that don't fit, and you categorize them. If they're hostile, you engage. If they're inexplicable and silent, you just document the data anomalies and keep your mouth shut. You wait to see if they bring it up. When I landed, the ground crew found nothing wrong with my jet. No radar glitch, no sensor burnout. The flight logs were clean, except for a few seconds of corrupted data at the exact moment the white light had frozen above me. My maintenance chief, a grizzled old-timer named Sergeant Cruz, just shrugged and chalked it up to an atmospheric effect. But I saw the flicker in his eyes. He knew. We all knew something was out there, but we were paid to pretend we didn't. Over the next 2 weeks, the silence was worse than any engine roar. I flew the same route every night. I searched for the light. I felt my eyes constantly scanning the inky black of the lake, waiting for that impossible flash of green. Nothing. The sky was silent, beautiful, and utterly normal. That was the most terrifying part, the return to normalcy after witnessing the unnatural. Then came the call. It wasn't through official channels. It was a secure satellite phone, the kind only used for 2 things: an immediate global threat or a deep-level security breach. It was Major General Hayes, a man whose voice could freeze a room at 50 paces. He didn't ask about the corrupted data. He didn't ask about the anomaly. He just said 3 words: New Patrol Zone. My new zone was a small, tightly defined box, only about 10 square miles, located directly over the deepest, most inaccessible part of Lake Tahoe. I was instructed to fly lower, dangerously low, and to use specialized sonar and magnetic anomaly detection equipment that had been quickly installed in my jet overnight, equipment I had never seen before. The cover story, the one I had to put in the logs, was monitoring deep-sea mining exploration, which in the pristine national treasure of Tahoe was ludicrous. The real briefing was even more unsettling. Hayes didn't mince words. "Riley," he said, his voice a low gravel, "you were looking for an unidentified submerged object. We have reason to believe there is a persistent, non-terrestrial anomaly operating below the thermocline. It is silent, it is fast, and it is ours." Ours. That word hung in the air like poison. Was he admitting the military had alien technology? Or was this a massive, decades-long cover-up of something they couldn't control? Hayes leaned closer to the camera on the secure line. His eyes were cold and dead. "Listen closely, Maverick. Whatever you find down there, it doesn't belong to any nation on Earth. And if it decides to leave, you are the only warning the western seaboard will get." At night, I took off under the same thin moon, but this time, the mission felt completely different. I wasn't searching the sky anymore. I was staring into the black depths of the lake, using new sensors to probe the unmapped underbelly of America. As I crossed the patrol box, the magnetic anomaly detector started to chirp softly, a faint but unmistakable signature. It was deep, too deep for any known submersible. It wasn't moving, it was massive. It was just there, beneath the cold, clean water of Lake Tahoe, a mountain of silent, dense metal, resting in the darkness. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, far heavier than any G-force. I looked down at the dark water, knowing that somewhere, thousands of feet below me, an impossible secret was waiting. And I was flying directly over its head.
For 3 nights, I was simply an observer, a lonely ghost circling a watery grave. My routine became a meditative terror. Take off, ascend, fly low over the Sierra peaks, all while pretending the sonar's constant low-frequency hum wasn't mapping a metallic behemoth thousands of feet below me. The target was nestled deep inside a feature known locally as the Black Trench. It's the deepest point of Tahoe, a massive geological depression where the sunlight simply cannot reach. The water down there is perpetually cold, just above freezing, and the pressure is crushing. It's an environment where nothing human is meant to survive, yet the anomaly was thriving in it. My magnetic sensor readings were spiking, not randomly, but with a rhythmic, almost biological consistency. It felt less like a wreckage and more like a colossal, silent, sleeping leviathan. Hayes' words echoed in my helmet every time I flew over that spot. It's silent, it's fast, and it's ours. I couldn't shake the phrase. If it was ours, why the secrecy? Why the non-disclosure agreement signed under duress? Why the specialized, custom-built sensors that looked like they were bolted on my plane by frantic engineers just hours before my flight? The paranoia was starting to settle in my bones. I stopped sleeping well, When I did, it wasn't the noise of the jet that woke me, but the silence, the impossible silence of that first light, which had moved without air displacement, without sonic boom, without friction. I started to use the jet's infrared camera to scan the surface of the lake, looking for the telltale heat bloom of a massive engine firing up or the subtle ripples of a displacement. But Tahoe, in its chilling wisdom, gave up nothing, just the smooth, black glass of the water. One night, however, something changed. I was flying my lowest pass, right at the minimum safe altitude over the water, about a quarter mile from the shore where the granite cliffs drop almost vertically into the trench. The water was so close, I could almost feel the spray. The magnetic anomaly signature, usually a steady, heavy presence, began to fluctuate. Not randomly, but with intention, it pulsed. It was subtle, almost like a heartbeat slowing down before a sudden surge. And then I detected a faint acoustic signature, a noise that shouldn't exist in that environment. It wasn't a sound in the way we understand it. It was a resonance, a deep, subaudible vibration that seemed to travel through the water, up through the altitude, and directly into the core of my jet. It rattled the bolts. My flight stick felt alive. I looked at the acoustic readout, and the display showed a perfect sine wave. Too perfect, too controlled. It was a technological hum. A machine was communicating. I immediately increased altitude, heart pounding. My training screamed at me to retreat, to follow General Hayes's direct order, under no circumstances approach the water. But the pilot in me, the curious, arrogant, maverick part, had to know what was making that sound. I looked down. Right at the center of the magnetic spike, a slight disturbance appeared on the water's surface. Not a wave, but a localized ripple, as if a drop of oil had hit a massive glass table. The moon, now brighter than before, caught the edge of it, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw light beneath the ripple. Not the emerald flash from before, but a cold, deep blue glow, like the bioluminescence of a deep-sea creature that had grown to the size of a city block. I clicked the record button on the new sensor package, my hands shaking again. I knew in that moment that this was not a downed military satellite. This was not some clandestine human experiment. This was a base, a machine, a presence that had been sitting in the sacred quiet of Lake Tahoe for God knows how long, running silent operations right under the nose of the American military. And for the first time, it was stirring. I needed to see it closer. I needed to understand the shape of that ripple. I was descending when the radio crackled to life, not with a voice, but with a horrifying, ear-splitting static burst that blew out my right earphone. A warning. I pulled back on the stick instantly, my mission of observation abruptly transforming into a terrifying game of hide-and-seek.
The static burst wasn't just interference. It was a physical assault. The high-frequency shriek didn't just overload my comms, it felt like it bypassed my helmet and rattled the fluid in my inner ear. I immediately aborted the descent, pulling the jet up and away from the center of the ripple. My training took over, prioritizing flight stability and system diagnostics. As I climbed out of the exclusion zone, the magnetic anomaly signature slowly returned to its heavy, steady state, the heartbeat of the sleeping behemoth. The blue light beneath the water vanished. The ripples smoothed out, leaving Tahoe's surface black and undisturbed, as if it had simply shrugged off my intrusion. When I landed back at the facility, I was met not by Sergeant Cruz, but by two men in ill-fitting dark suits who materialized out of the shadows of the hangar. They weren't MIB, not the cartoon version, but they carried the same palpable authority. They wore no insignias, and they were utterly silent. They walked me directly to an interrogation room, no, a debriefing room, as they corrected me with chilling smiles. General Hayes was on the secure monitor again, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Captain Riley," he began, the gravel in his voice now laced with ice. "Your proximity report indicates a violation of Protocol 7, subsection Beta. You were specifically ordered not to approach the anomaly's center. Explain your deviation." I presented the facts. The magnetic fluctuation, the acoustic resonance, the technological hum, and the localized ripple. I described the moment I realized the object was actively transmitting a signal. Hayes listened, his gaze unblinking. "And the static burst, Captain?" "It overloaded my communications, sir. It felt like an intentional electronic countermeasure." Hayes paused, leaning back, the picture of measured menace. "Captain, the only system failure we detected was a minor power surge in your auxiliary radar, consistent with flying too low and close to known high-power transmission lines near the town of Truckee. The acoustic resonance you detected, consistent with geological sub-sea tremors. The ripple, wind shear, and the communication static, your right earphone has been diagnosed with a wiring fault." The calculated arrogance of his denial hit me harder than the sonic burst. He wasn't just covering up the anomaly, he was surgically deconstructing my reality. He was replacing what I knew to be true with a clinical, plausible lie. "With all due respect, General," I pressed, the adrenaline making my voice tight, "the data is recorded. The new sensor package registered a massive, rhythmic magnetic return that is stationary beneath the deepest part of Tahoe. That is not geological." Hayes' smile was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. "The data you recorded, Captain, is being cross-referenced with local mining survey data, the official cover. Any remaining discrepancies will be attributed to an unreleased, highly classified Navy-submerged acoustic mapping drone that we are testing in the area. A domestic project. Nothing to see here." He made it sound so mundane. A Navy drone. But I knew the truth. Navy drones don't emit a silent hyperspeed light at 50,000 feet. Navy drones don't emit a signal that shatters your eardrum as a warning. The debriefing ended with a clear threat. My next flights would be strictly monitored by an AWCS based far away. Any further deviation would be treated as an act of treason and an international incident. I was dismissed. The two silent men escorted me back to my quarters. I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, looking at the window, not seeing the stars, but seeing the immense, cold blackness of the lake. They had given me a choice: either accept their lie and fly the clean flight path, or try to prove the existence of an alien intelligence that was literally resting beneath a US landmark. And as the sun finally began to rise, painting the Sierra peaks with pale gold, I decided I would fly their path, but I would also find a way to get back to the Black Trench. I had to know what was down there. I had to know who or what had sent that chilling, silent warning. The secret was no longer just the government's. It was mine.
For the next 4 nights, I was the perfect pilot. I flew the clean routes, reported clear sensors, and logged the mandated Navy submerged acoustic mapping drone activity. The AWACS monitored me, a silent, invisible tether keeping me bound to the military's carefully constructed lie. I was a puppet, performing a silent ballet of denial over the beautiful, unsuspecting surface of Tahoe. But obedience was simply my new strategy. I was using my time in the cockpit to meticulously study the AWACS patrol patterns and the facility's internal shift changes. I was looking for the loophole in their system of control. My chance finally came during a major weather front moving in from the Pacific, a serious winter storm scheduled to bring heavy snow and dangerous turbulence to the Sierra Nevadas. All non-essential flight operations were grounded. The AWACS was pulled back to a safer, higher altitude over central Nevada, its effectiveness reduced by the storm's electromagnetic noise and cloud cover. The facility's skeleton crew would be focused on weather contingency, not my silent revolt. I knew I had one window, the pre-dawn hours before the worst of the storm hit, when the weather was bad enough to mask me, but not so bad that it made flying impossible. I used my unauthorized access codes I had earned over a decade of classified service, to manipulate the internal flight manifest. I logged a high-altitude atmospheric test flight using an older, slower surveillance jet. It was a plane without the cutting-edge, tamper-proof sensors of my main fighter, but it had one crucial advantage. Its older systems were less connected to the central military grid and thus less prone to remote sabotage by General Hayes's watchful eyes. That night, I took off under a sky already bruised purple and gray by the approaching storm. The air was thick, heavy with static electricity. As I flew toward the black trench, the old surveillance jet rattled and protested, a stark contrast to the smooth silence of my usual fighter. But the noise was a comfort. It was my noise, not the impossible silence of the anomaly. When I reached the coordinates, the magnetic signature was more defined than ever. The pressure drop from the storm seemed to make the anomaly resonate with increased force. The rhythmic pulsing was louder, and the acoustic sensors registered deep, resonating clicks. Not a language, but definitely a technological sequence. A massive machine was powering up, or perhaps stirring. I descended slowly, cutting my engines to near idle and riding the high winds. I was so close to the water's surface that the storm's wind created whitecaps, violently churning the black water. And that's when I saw it. Not the whole thing, but a structure. The deep blue bioluminescence was back, brighter than before, fighting the turbulent surface, and beneath the churning water, I could finally discern a vague, incomprehensible shape. It wasn't saucer-shaped. It wasn't the sleek, streamlined shape of a conventional submersible. It was pyramidal, a colossal, angular mass, blacker than the water with edges that defied the concept of rust or corrosion. It looked ancient, but the pulsating blue light was hyper-modern, radiating from thousands of tiny, perfectly spaced vents along the structure's angled sides. It was immense, vastly larger than a carrier, a true submerged city. But the most chilling realization was the scale. The sheer size suggested that it couldn't have been built by any human power, yet its rigid, engineered geometry felt familiar. It wasn't the graceful, organic smoothness often associated with alien craft. This was cold, hard, unyielding engineering. It looked like a temple built for a god of silence at the bottom of the ocean. As I hovered, staring down into the violent whitecaps, the truth hit me with the force of a high G turn. Maybe this wasn't an invasion. Maybe this was a reclamation, a technology so old, so powerful that it predated human history, simply resting beneath the continent. Suddenly, the turbulence around my jet turned violent, not from the storm, but from a localized, intense air displacement. The water below the pyramidal shape began to boil violently, and the black mass of the structure shifted, slowly, majestically, and with terrifying certainty. I didn't need a warning this time. I was witnessing the colossal object prepare to move. I threw the throttle forward, my old jet screaming against the sudden displacement, pulling hard to escape the imminent emergence of something that did not belong to the sky, and certainly not to the earth. The ancient secret of Tahoe was waking up.
The old surveillance jet screamed in protest, buffeted by the localized atmospheric disturbance now emanating from the churning surface of Lake Tahoe. The entire air column above the black trench seemed to be vibrating with an impossible energy. I was fighting the stick, wrestling the ancient beast of a plane away from the epicenter of the emerging horror. The storm's natural turbulence became a chaotic ballet with this new, terrifying force. The pyramidal structure, blacker than any shadow, continued its slow, deliberate ascent. It wasn't breaching the surface with a violent splash, but rather displacing the water with an unnatural grace, as if the lake itself were parting for its ancient master. The deep blue light intensified, now casting an eerie phosphorescent glow onto the low-hanging storm clouds, turning them a sickly, unnatural cyan. I looked back, trying to keep the rising object in my sight, even as my instruments went wild. The magnetic anomaly detector was now pegged at maximum, screaming. My altimeter was fluctuating erratically, and the old radar was completely useless, blinded by the sheer electromagnetic output of the thing below. As the tip of the pyramid finally broke the surface, the localized disturbance intensified, throwing my jet into a violent pitch. I fought for control, my vision blurring, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the lake. What emerged was beyond anything I had ever conceived. It wasn't a ship in the traditional sense. It was a mountain of impossibly smooth, obsidian-like material, its sharp angles cutting the churning water. There were no discernible seams, no rivets, no entry points visible to the naked eye. Just pure, unblemished geometry, reflecting the pale, storm-laced moonlight in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It continued to rise, reaching what I estimated to be hundreds of feet above the lake's surface. And it was massive, wider than any aircraft carrier, its base encompassing a significant portion of the Black Trench. The top of the pyramid tapered to a flat, featureless platform, devoid of any antennas or propulsion systems. It just was. And then I saw the first movement on its surface, not a mechanical movement, but something akin to a shimmering. Along the angled faces of the pyramid, countless small, perfectly geometric patterns, squares, circles, triangles, began to glow with the same deep blue light, shifting and changing like an alien language being projected onto its skin. It was beautiful in its terrifying precision, an unfathomable display of power. The air around it began to crackle, not with thunder, but with a pure, raw energy that felt like the hairs on my arms stand on end. The static in my remaining good earphone returned, a low, guttural growl that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. It wasn't just disrupting my electronics, it was disrupting my very perception of reality. I realized then that this wasn't just a base, this was a power generator, a focal point, and its awakening was drawing an unimaginable amount of energy from somewhere deep within the earth, channeled through Lake Tahoe. My old jet was now struggling against the invisible forces radiating from the object. Warning lights flashed across my panel, fuel pressure dropping, engine temperature spiking. I was caught in its gravitational, or perhaps electromagnetic wake. I knew I had to get out, not just for my life, but for the information. General Hayes and his silent men had dismissed my claims. They believed their own lies. But this was a colossal, undeniable truth emerging from the depths of America's most cherished lake. With a final desperate heave on the stick, I banked hard, pushing the old jet to its absolute limit. I felt the familiar pull of G-forces, but this time it was fighting against something far more primal, far more ancient. I was escaping the presence of a god or perhaps a demon that had slumbered beneath the waters of Tahoe for millennia. And now it was awake. As I pulled away, gaining precious altitude, I took one last, terrified look over my shoulder. The storm raged, but through a momentary break in the clouds, the enormous black pyramid stood sentinel, radiating its eerie blue light, silently dominating the landscape. It wasn't just an object. It was a statement, a declaration that the world, as we knew it, was about to change.
I flew east, away from the furious, light-emitting heart of the Tahoe Anomaly. The old jet was battered, shaking off the last electromagnetic tremors, but I was alive. I had the confirmation I needed, visual, acoustic, and magnetic data, proving the existence of a monumental, non-terrestrial structure beneath Lake Tahoe. But the real threat wasn't the object I was escaping, it was the people I was flying toward. About 50 miles from the facility, my radio, the working left channel, crackled to life, not with static, but with a new cold voice. Captain Riley, you're instructed to divert immediately to Fallon Naval Air Station. You have violated a restricted military airspace and will be escorted to the ground. Acknowledge. It was the AWACS.
They had seen my deviation. They had probably tracked the power surge from the Black Trench. They hadn't tried to stop me with words. They had simply waited for me to re-enter their sphere of influence. "This is Maverick," I replied, my voice hoarse. "I'm experiencing major systems failure due to extreme weather. I require emergency vectoring to home base." The voice was ice cold. "Negative, Captain. Your flight data indicates you performed unauthorized maneuvers outside your mandated flight plan. You are in violation of multiple statutes. Divert now or face interception." I looked down at the dash. My fuel reserves were dangerously low. I couldn't outrun a fast interceptor, and even if I tried, my sluggish surveillance jet was no match for a modern fighter. I had exposed the truth, but I couldn't let them seize the evidence I had risked everything for. I made the decision in a heartbeat. I would not land at Fallon. I would not let General Hayes' silent men wipe my memory and incinerate the data. I set the autopilot on a low altitude heading toward a desolate stretch of the Nevada desert, a place I knew well, a maze of canyons and dry riverbeds, perfect for disappearing. Then I began working. My mission wasn't to survive the interrogation, it was to preserve the truth. I had about 20 minutes until they would send fighters after me. I pulled out the hard drive from the newly installed sensor package. It was a rugged, military-grade unit, but I knew the backup encryption code. I worked feverishly, overriding the automated wipe protocol, and began copying the critical data, the magnetic spike, the acoustic hum, and the final infrared image of the pyramidal structure onto a series of highly secure miniaturized memory cards I always kept hidden in my flight vest. A pilot's superstition, now a life-saving precaution. As I finished the transfer, I heard the faint, distant roar of two fast jets closing in, interceptors. They wouldn't fire without confirmation, but they would force me down. I had to ditch the plane, and more importantly, ditch the official evidence. I pulled the manual eject lever for the sensor hard drive bay, jettisoning the primary evidence into the remote desert. Let them find the wreckage and the corrupted drive. It would confirm their Navy drone lie, while the real evidence remained secured on my person. Then I armed the self-destruct mechanism on the old surveillance jet, a legacy protocol for sensitive aircraft crash retrieval. I didn't want them analyzing the residual energy spikes the pyramid had left in the fuselage. With the jets closing fast, their radar painting my plane with hostile intensity, I pulled the eject handle. The blast was immediate, violent. The parachute opened with a sickening jerk, swinging me under the vast, stormy Nevada sky. Below me, the old surveillance jet hit the desert floor in a brilliant, silent explosion, turning into a ball of smoke and fire. I was falling toward the remote, hostile ground, my body bruised and shaken, but clutching the memory cards like they were the key to the universe. As I watched the two interceptors circle the wreckage, not yet realizing I had escaped, I understood the depth of the conspiracy. The pyramid in Tahoe wasn't just a military secret, it was a fundamental shift in reality that the government was willing to kill or disappear to maintain. Now, I was alone, a former highly decorated pilot, injured and stranded in the American desert, holding the only true evidence of an ancient alien presence that had just awakened beneath one of the nation's most beautiful and sacred places. My war had just begun.
I hit the ground hard. The parachute dragged me a few yards through the rocks and scrub brush before snagging on a tough piece of desert cedar. The impact was brutal. I felt a sharp pain flare in my left ankle, but the adrenaline masked the severity. My priority wasn't the pain, it was the memory cards tucked deep inside a secured pocket in my flight vest. They were intact. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, painting the remote Nevada desert in stark shadows. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road, and the two circling interceptors were already gone, heading back to report a successful downing of an unauthorized aircraft. They likely assumed I perished in the fire. I had to maintain that illusion. My training kicked in. I immediately stripped off the parachute harness, buried the chute under rocks and dirt, and started moving. I needed to find shelter and water before the sun turned the desert into an oven. My ankle screamed with every step, forcing me to lean heavily on a broken branch I fashioned into a makeshift crutch. As I limped through the desolate terrain, my mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together. The pyramid in Tahoe, General Hayes's relentless denial, the calculated interception. The connection was clear. This wasn't a cover-up of an incident. This was a decades-long program designed to keep a colossal, non-human technology hidden in plain sight. But the question remained, why now? Why did the silent mountain awaken? I had been moving for maybe 2 hours when I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible access road leading to a cluster of old, abandoned mining structures half hidden in the mouth of a narrow canyon. It looked like a derelict site, perfect for hiding from satellite imagery. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. If this was a military retrieval point, I was finished. But my instinct, honed by years of covert operations, told me otherwise. The silence felt different here. It felt weighted. I found a small, rusted pickup truck parked behind a crumbling shack. As I neared, the door to the shack creaked open and a figure emerged. It wasn't a Marine. It wasn't a man in a black suit. It was an elderly woman, dressed in threadbare denim and holding a steaming mug. She had eyes that seemed to hold the cold wisdom of the desert itself. She didn't show an ounce of surprise. She simply said, her voice dry as the air, "You're late, Maverick, and you look like hell." My jaw dropped. "How do you know that name?" She pointed the mug toward the interior of the shack. "Hayes sent a signal spike to the entire region when that jet blew up. We've been waiting for a body to walk out of the smoke, or a ghost. Looks like you're somewhere in between." Her name was Esther. She claimed to be an ex-NSA cartographer who had worked on Project Blue Book decades ago, before she went rogue. She had been living off-grid in this self-sustaining safe house for over 20 years, monitoring the same deep state channels that I had just flown out of. "You saw the structure, didn't you, Jake?" she asked me, using my real name, which felt dangerously intimate. I confirmed it, showing her the tiny memory cards. Esther didn't need to see the data. She just nodded slowly, looking out at the vast, empty desert. "They call it the Sentinel. It has been sleeping under Tahoe for at least 3,000 years. It's an energy nexus. The government has known about it since the 50s. They haven't been covering up an alien base. They've been protecting their energy source." She explained that the pyramid wasn't just resting, it was slowly drawing power, and its sudden activation was a huge event. And the only thing that could trigger its full awakening wasn't a command from us, but a specific cosmic alignment. "General Hayes isn't scared of the aliens, Jake," Esther said, looking me dead in the eye. "He's scared of losing the single greatest technological advantage in human history, and anyone who exposes it dies. Now drink this. You need to rest. We have to figure out how to transmit those files before they find us." The mug she gave me contained bitter, earthy tea, but it was the most comforting thing I'd tasted in days. I looked at this unassuming elderly woman who was apparently a key player in the biggest conspiracy I had ever encountered. The sanctuary was temporary, but the connection felt real. I had found an ally, and together we had to find a way to let the world know that Lake Tahoe was now a silent, ticking time bomb.
Esther's shack was a sanctuary built on the foundations of fear and knowledge. While I rested my injured ankle, she explained her plan. She had an ancient, high-powered shortwave radio rig, a relic from the Cold War, which she had secretly modified to punch through the high-grade military encryption and jammers active across the western states. "We can't use the internet, Jake," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the small, humming machine. "They monitor everything. But the old radio waves, the noise they ignore, that's our window." Our target was a network of independent journalists and former government analysts Esther had maintained contact with for 2 decades. People who had also been burned by the deep state and were scattered across the globe waiting for the signal. We worked for hours. My job was to prepare the files, convert the raw magnetic, acoustic, and infrared data of the pyramidal structure into a compressed, universally readable format. Esther worked on the transmission, tuning the antique radio set with the precision of a master surgeon. The smell of ozone and hot electronics filled the cramped shack. As night fell over the desert, Esther pointed to the small, hand-drawn map tacked on the wall. The AWACS will be back on rotation in 2 hours. Once they are up, they will spot this energy signature instantly. We have 1 attempt. The tension was a physical presence. I felt the pressure of the Lake Tahoe Anomaly on one side, the massive, silent technology that could change the world, and the relentless, overwhelming pursuit of the US military on the other. "Why haven't they found you before?" I asked, looking at the isolation of the canyon. "Because they're looking for a disgruntled pilot with a high-tech signature. They aren't looking for an old woman with a vacuum tube radio," she said, giving me a rare, grim smile. "We are the ghost in the machine, Jake." At precisely 2 a.m., the time slot Esther had calculated based on the lowest atmospheric interference and a momentary lull in military air traffic, she gave the nod. I inserted the memory card into the radio's interface, and Esther threw the master switch. The shack immediately filled with a deafening buzz. The old radio rig, powered by a hidden diesel generator, began to hum with a furious metallic intensity. The transmission light glowed a fierce, steady red. "We're broadcasting," Esther shouted over the noise. "It's clean. It's punching through the noise. 20 minutes for the full data transfer." I watched the progress bar crawl across the tiny screen, every percentage point an agonizing victory. 5%, 10%, 20%. Then the humming changed. It became jagged, strained. The lights in the shack flickered violently. "They're hitting us with a jammer!" Esther yelled, frantically adjusting the dials. "It's high power! They found the spike!" I knew what that meant. General Hayes wasn't sending a polite warning this time. He was sending a direct attack. Through the crackle of the jamming signal, another sound pierced the night. The unmistakable thump-thump-thump of a heavy military helicopter closing fast. Blackhawks. "They have a fix on us, Jake. They're coming in hot." 50%. 60%. The sound of the rotor wash was deafening now, vibrating the fragile walls of the shack. "We have to go!" I shouted, grabbing my crutch. "No, not yet!" Esther gripped the main tuning dial. "We have to hit 80%. That's enough for the analyst to reassemble the code. Get ready!" I limped to the window, peering into the darkness. A searchlight, blindingly bright, swept across the canyon entrance. I could see the dark silhouettes of 2 Blackhawks hovering just outside our canyon mouth. Men rappelling down. They were not taking prisoners. 75%. 78%. "Now, Jake, it's enough! Grab the memory card!" I lunged for the card, pulling it free just as the front door of the shack was kicked inward with a deafening crash. 2 masked, heavily armed soldiers in unmarked fatigues stormed the room, rifles raised. Esther, with a speed that defied her age, reached past me and slammed a large, archaic switch on the radio panel, the main power cutoff, and with a blinding flash and a puff of smoke, the broadcast died. "The transmission is out," she breathed, her face triumphant despite the chaos. "They have enough!" The soldiers froze for a split second, confused by the sudden power outage. That was my only chance. I grabbed Esther's arm and pulled her towards a small, previously unnoticed escape hatch hidden under a pile of worn blankets. We tumbled into the dark earth tunnel just as the soldiers realized we were not surrendering. The air above us exploded with muffled shouts and the sound of heavy boots. We were underground, but we were far from safe. The only thing separating us from the deep state was a thin layer of desert earth. Esther's shack was a sanctuary built on the foundations of fear and knowledge. While I rested my injured ankle, she explained her plan. She had an ancient, high-powered shortwave radio rig, a relic from the Cold War, which she had secretly modified to punch through the high-grade military encryption and jammers active across the western states. "We can't use the internet, Jake," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the small, humming machine. "They monitor everything, but the old radio waves, the noise they ignore, that's our window." Our target was a network of independent journalists and former government analysts Esther had maintained contact with for 2 decades, people who had also been burned by the deep state and were scattered across the globe, waiting for the signal. We worked for hours. My job was to prepare the files,
convert the raw magnetic, acoustic, and infrared data of the pyramidal structure into a compressed, universally readable format. Esther worked on the transmission, tuning the antique radio set with the precision of a master surgeon. The smell of ozone and hot electronics filled the cramped shack. As night fell over the desert, Esther pointed to the small, hand-drawn map tacked to the wall. The AWACS will be back on rotation in 2 hours. Once they are up, they will spot this energy signature instantly. We have one attempt. The tension was a physical presence. I felt the pressure of the Lake Tahoe Anomaly on one side, the massive, silent technology that could change the world, and the relentless, overwhelming pursuit of the U.S. military on the other. "Why haven't they found you before?" I asked, looking at the isolation of the canyon. "Because they are looking for a disgruntled pilot with a high-tech signature. They aren't looking for an old woman with a vacuum tube radio," she said, giving me a rare, grim smile. "We are the ghost in the machine, Jake." At precisely 2 a.m., the time slot Esther had calculated based on the lowest atmospheric interference and a momentary lull in military air traffic, she gave the nod. I inserted the memory card into the radio's interface, and Esther threw the master switch. The shack immediately filled with a deafening buzz. The old radio rig, powered by a hidden diesel generator, began to hum with a furious metallic intensity. The transmission light glowed a fierce, steady red. "We are broadcasting," Esther shouted over the noise. "It's clean. It's punching through the noise. 20 minutes for the full data transfer." I watched the progress bar crawl across the tiny screen, every percentage point an agonizing victory. 5%, 10%, 20%. Then, the humming changed. It became jagged, strained. The lights in the shack flickered violently. "They're hitting us with a jammer," Esther yelled, frantically adjusting the dials. "It's high power. They found the spike." I knew what that meant. General Hayes wasn't sending a polite warning this time. He was sending a direct attack. Through the crackle of the jamming signal, another sound pierced the night. The unmistakable thump, thump, thump of a heavy military helicopter closing fast. Blackhawks. "They have a fix on us, Jake. They're coming in hot." 50%, 60%. The sound of the rotor wash was deafening now, vibrating the fragile walls of the shack. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing my crutch. "No, not yet." Esther gripped the main tuning dial. "We have to hit 80%. That's enough for the analysts to reassemble the code. Get ready." I limped to the window, peering out into the darkness. A searchlight, blindingly bright, swept across the canyon entrance. I could see the dark silhouettes of 2 Blackhawks hovering just outside our canyon mouth, men rappelling down. They were not taking prisoners. 75%, 78%. "Now, Jake, it's enough. Grab the memory card." I lunged for the card, pulling it free just as the front door of the shack was kicked inward with a deafening crash. 2 masked, heavily armed soldiers in unmarked fatigues stormed the room, rifles raised. Esther, with a speed that defied her age, reached past me and slammed a large archaic switch on the radio panel. The main power cut off, and with a blinding flash and a puff of smoke, the broadcast died. "The transmission is out," she breathed, her face triumphant despite the chaos. "They have enough." The soldiers froze for a split second, confused by the sudden power outage. That was my only chance. I grabbed Esther's arm and pulled her toward a small, previously unnoticed escape hatch hidden beneath a pile of worn blankets. We tumbled into the dark earth tunnel just as the soldiers realized we were not surrendering. The air above us exploded with muffled shouts and the sound of heavy boots. We were underground, but we were far from safe. The only thing separating us from the deep state was a thin layer of desert earth.